She chose her lover. I chose peace and my children's future. Welcome to Michael Tells Stories. Here, I share daily infidelity stories about unfaithful wives. Thank you for listening. I learned the exact weight of silence on a Tuesday evening when the house smelled like reheated soup and rain. When the children were asleep with their mouths open and their dreams still innocent. And my wife sat across from me at the kitchen table with her phone face down. Her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm she didn't realize she was playing. And in that moment I understood that love does not always end with shouting or slammed doors, but sometimes with a quiet exhaustion that seeps into the walls. Into the furniture. Into the way you breathe. Because when she finally looked at me, her eyes already elsewhere, already halfway gone, and said his name without saying his name, I felt something inside me loosen rather than break. As if a knot I'd been tightening for years had finally given up. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that this was not the night my marriage died. It was the night I stopped fighting a war that had been over for a long time. She told me she was confused. That she deserved to feel alive. That she hadn't meant for it to happen this way. The usual sentences that sound reasonable only to the person saying them. And I listened without interrupting. Not because I was noble but because I was tired. Tired of translating my needs into a language she no longer spoke. Tired of pretending that her distance was temporary when it had become a permanent climate. And while she spoke I watched a drop of water slide down the window and wondered how many small unnoticed moments like this had passed while I was busy being the reliable one. The steady one. The man who came home on time and paid bills and kissed scraped knees. And when she finished she waited for anger. For accusations. For the dramatic collapse she could later describe to friends as proof that leaving was necessary. But what she got instead was my silence and then a question so simple it surprised us both. I asked her if she loved him. Not in the hopeful tone of a man bargaining for his marriage but in the flat voice of someone checking the weather. And when she hesitated I knew the answer. Because hesitation is a form of truth people use when they are ashamed of certainty. And in that hesitation I felt the final shift. The moment I chose peace not as surrender but as strategy. Because I looked down the hallway toward the children's rooms and realized that whatever storm was about to break would shape their understanding of love. Of safety. Of how adults behave when things fall apart. And I refused to teach them that love is loud and cruel and humiliating. I refused to let my pain become their inheritance. That night we slept in the same bed with a gulf between us wider than any physical distance. Her body tense and unfamiliar. Mine heavy with thoughts that came in waves. Memories of our early years when she laughed easily and believed in forever. Memories of the slow erosion. The missed dinners. The conversations that became logistics. The way she stopped asking how my day was because she had stopped caring about the answer. And by morning I had made a decision that would confuse people later when they heard the story. Because when she said she wanted space, wanted time, wanted to see where her feelings led, I didn't beg or threaten or negotiate. I simply nodded and told her we would talk about the children first. And the look on her face then was not relief but confusion. Because she had prepared herself for a different version of me. A weaker one perhaps. Or a louder one. Not a man who could detach his ego from his responsibilities. And as days turned into weeks and her absence became routine. As she stayed out late and stopped pretending. I focused on the mundane heroism of single parenting without the title. Packing lunches. Learning the exact temperature that soothed my daughter's nightmares. Memorizing the way my son liked his stories read. Slower than I thought necessary. And in those quiet acts I found a dignity that surprised me. A sense of self not dependent on being chosen romantically. And people around us began to talk. Because they always do. They whispered about her affair. About my calm. About how unnatural it was that I didn't explode. And I let them talk. Because peace is often mistaken for weakness by those who don't understand its cost. And there were nights, of course, when the house was too quiet and the memories too loud. Nights when I sat alone and wondered if I had failed as a husband. If my steadiness had bored her into betrayal. If love requires a certain chaos to survive. And on those nights I allowed myself to feel the grief fully but privately. Never in front of the children. Never in front of her. Because I was done performing my pain for anyone's validation. And when she finally said she was leaving. Really leaving. Choosing him openly now. She expected tears or rage. But what she saw was a man who had already grieved. Already rebuilt his internal landscape. And I told her I hoped she would be happy. Not as a moral victory but because bitterness would only chain me to a story I was ready to outgrow. And as she packed her things I felt a strange gratitude for the clarity. Because ambiguity is the cruelest form of loss. And that night, after the door closed and the echo faded, I stood in the living room surrounded by the evidence of a shared life and realized that while she had chosen passion, uncertainty, and herself, I had chosen peace, stability, and my children's future. And it was not the lesser choice. Even if it was quieter. And in that quiet, something new began to grow. Something patient and strong. Something that would later surprise even me. The weeks after she left did not arrive with drama but with logistics. With calendars that needed adjusting and school forms that suddenly listed only one parent. With the awkward choreography of explaining absence to children without turning their mother into a villain or myself into a martyr. And I learned quickly that heartbreak is not a single wound but 1,000 small inconveniences that reopen it daily. Like standing in the grocery store realizing you no longer buy the brand she liked. Or hearing a song on the radio that once belonged to us and now felt like borrowed property. And yet beneath that constant ache there was a surprising sense of order returning to my life. Because without the tension of waiting for her attention or decoding her moods, the air in the house felt cleaner, the silence less accusatory, and the children noticed it too in ways they couldn't articulate. My daughter sleeping through the night more often. My son asking fewer anxious questions. As if their bodies had been absorbing the unspoken conflict long before I admitted it was there. And it was during one of those ordinary evenings. While helping with homework at the kitchen table she used to scroll through her phone that I realized how much of myself I had been compressing to fit a marriage that no longer expanded me. How often I had softened my opinions, delayed my dreams, chosen peace at the cost of authenticity. And now, in choosing peace again, this time deliberately and for the right reasons, I was reclaiming parts of myself I had misplaced years earlier. Co-parenting began with tense politeness. Texts carefully worded, exchanges conducted like diplomatic meetings. And I could sense her surprise that I did not use the children as leverage. That I did not poison them against her. That I refused the small satisfactions of revenge disguised as concern. Because I understood something she hadn't yet learned. That the story you tell your children about the other parent eventually becomes the story they tell themselves about love. And I would not make love sound like betrayal and chaos even if that was part of the truth. And over time her messages grew shorter, less defensive, as if my refusal to play the expected role unsettled her more than anger would have. And there were moments, brief and human, when I saw doubt flicker through her confidence. Especially when she noticed the children thriving. When she realized I was not drowning without her. But I did not savor those moments. Because my growth was not a performance for her regret. It was a necessity for my survival. I began waking early. Not out of anxiety but intention. Running before the city stirred. Feeling my body remind me it was capable of strength. And with each mile I shed another layer of the man who had waited to be chosen. Replacing him with someone grounded in self-respect. And people noticed. Friends commenting on the calm in my voice. The steadiness in my gaze. And inevitably they asked if I was dating. If I was lonely. If I planned to move on quickly or stay wounded out of loyalty to a past that had already moved on without me. And I answered honestly that I was not in a hurry. That loneliness was no longer my enemy. That solitude had become a teacher showing me where I had abandoned myself before. And it was in that period of intentional stillness that I met her. Not in a dramatic encounter but in the most unremarkable setting. A parent-teacher meeting where she sat 2 rows ahead. Taking notes with an intensity that suggested she took small responsibilities seriously. And when our eyes met there was no spark. No cinematic pause. Just a polite smile exchanged between 2 adults navigating similar terrains. And yet something about her presence lingered with me afterward. Not desire but curiosity. The sense of a person comfortable in her own skin. And weeks later, through a series of small coincidences. Conversations over coffee while waiting for children to finish activities. I learned her story. Not the details but the shape of it. A woman who had left a marriage that diminished her. Not for another man but for herself. Who spoke of boundaries as something learned late but defended fiercely. And listening to her I felt no urge to impress. No anxiety to secure her interest. Because for the first time in years I was not auditioning for love. I was simply present, and that presence changed everything. Because attraction built slowly, cautiously. Without the desperation that had once driven my choices. And when she eventually asked about my past I told her the truth without embellishment or bitterness. That my wife had chosen someone else and I had chosen peace. And instead of pity or judgment she offered understanding. A quiet respect that felt more intimate than sympathy ever could. And I realized then that healing is not the absence of pain but the presence of discernment. Knowing what you will no longer tolerate. What you will protect at all costs. And my children remained at the center of every decision. Their laughter the metric by which I measured progress. Their trust the currency I refused to devalue. And when my ex-wife noticed the shift. The way our interactions grew more balanced. Less weighted by unspoken history. She reacted unpredictably. Oscillating between guilt and defensiveness. Moments of nostalgia followed by assertions of happiness she seemed to need me to believe. And I listened kindly but without invitation. Because part of choosing peace is recognizing when a chapter is closed even if the other person keeps rereading it. And as months passed, the life I was building began to feel not like a consolation prize but a deliberate creation. One rooted in clarity and self-respect. And though I did not know then how this story would fully unfold, I sensed that the storm had not destroyed me. It had stripped me down to something truer. Something capable of love without losing itself again. The first real test of my resolve came unexpectedly. Not through conflict but through nostalgia. When my ex-wife called one evening long after the children were asleep. Her voice softer than it had been in months, carrying that familiar cadence that once made me believe everything could be fixed if we just talked long enough. And for a brief moment the past leaned toward me, heavy with what-ifs and shared history. And I listened as she spoke about confusion, about distance growing between her and the man she had chosen, about how life with him was not the escape she had imagined but another landscape with its own compromises. And while she talked I noticed something important. That my body did not tense the way it used to. My heart did not race. There was no surge of hope or fear. Only a quiet awareness that this conversation belonged to a version of me I no longer inhabited. And when she asked, carefully, whether I had ever considered that we might find our way back, I did not answer immediately. Not out of cruelty but because I wanted my response to come from truth rather than habit. And when I finally spoke I told her that I wished her well. Genuinely. But that the marriage we had shared no longer existed. That the man she was talking to had learned how to live without needing her validation. And that while I respected our history and our children bound us permanently, I would not rebuild a life on the ruins of trust. And there was silence then. The kind that carries both shock and loss. And I understood that my calm was more devastating to her than any accusation could have been. Because it meant I was free. Not waiting. Not secretly hoping for her return. And after the call ended I sat for a long time in the dark, acknowledging the small ache that remained. Not for her but for the younger version of myself who had believed love required endurance at any cost. And I let that ache pass without turning it into a story about failure. My relationship with the woman I had slowly grown close to remained intentionally undefined for a long time. Not out of fear but respect. Because we both understood that rushing intimacy after long marriages is often just a sophisticated form of avoidance. And instead we allowed trust to build in ordinary ways. Through reliability, through showing up when promised, through listening without needing to fix. And when we finally crossed the invisible line from friendship into something deeper, it felt less like falling and more like arriving. A recognition rather than a conquest. And what surprised me most was how easily my children accepted her presence. Not as a replacement but as an addition. Because she did not try to parent them or win their affection aggressively. She met them where they were. With patience and consistency. And in that restraint they felt safe. And I realized then that love which respects boundaries creates space for everyone to breathe. Co-parenting evolved too, becoming less reactive, more structured. And though my ex-wife struggled at times with the reality of our new equilibrium, she also grew in her own way, learning that being chosen by someone does not guarantee inner peace. That self-worth outsourced to another person always comes with interest. And while her path was no longer mine to manage, I felt no resentment watching her navigate it. Because I had learned that compassion does not require proximity, only clarity. There were moments, of course, When grief resurfaced unexpectedly, anniversaries, familiar places, the echo of a laugh that once belonged to us. But those moments no longer defined me. They were weather passing through a stable structure. And I had built that structure carefully, brick by brick, through choices that favored long-term dignity over short-term relief. And one evening, watching my children asleep, their faces relaxed and untroubled, I understood fully what I had chosen on that first quiet night in the kitchen. Not just peace as the absence of conflict, but peace as an environment where growth was possible, where love could exist without fear. And I knew then that regardless of how this new relationship unfolded, regardless of whether it became permanent or simply a chapter of healing, I had already won something far more valuable than reconciliation. I had secured a future grounded in self-respect. And that future, once unimaginable, now felt not only possible but deserved. The turning point did not arrive with a grand declaration or a dramatic reversal, but with an ordinary afternoon that quietly rearranged my understanding of love. When the woman who had been walking beside me with such care invited me to her small apartment for dinner. Not as a milestone but as a convenience. Because the children were with their mother that weekend and the weather had turned cold. And as I watched her move through her kitchen, unhurried, fully herself, humming softly without realizing it, I felt a recognition settle in my chest that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with safety. The kind of safety that allows you to exhale completely. And we talked that evening not about the past but about the future in abstract, hypothetical ways. About where we felt most alive. About the mistakes we would not repeat. About the values we had learned too late but would now defend fiercely. And at one point she looked at me and said something simple that stayed with me long after. She said she did not want to be chosen out of loneliness or gratitude. She wanted to be chosen freely. By someone who already felt whole. And in that moment I knew that whatever this was becoming, it was built on solid ground. Because I was no longer trying to fill a void. I was offering space. And the difference mattered. When the children eventually became more woven into our shared life. It happened gradually, intentionally, with conversations that respected their intelligence and emotions. And I told them the truth in a way appropriate to their age. That sometimes adults realize they're better parents apart than together. That love can change shape without disappearing. And that none of it was their fault. And watching them process this without fear or confusion confirmed that my restraint had not been wasted. That children do not need perfect families. They need honest ones. And my ex-wife, observing this new stability from a distance, began to soften in ways I did not anticipate. Not toward me romantically but toward herself. And one afternoon during a routine exchange she admitted quietly that leaving had not solved everything she thought it would. That she was learning, slowly, to sit with her own choices without rewriting history to make them painless. And I listened without judgment, offering neither absolution nor condemnation. Because her reckoning was hers alone. And the absence of emotional entanglement allowed compassion to exist where resentment once lived. The woman beside me continued to choose me in ways that were steady rather than dramatic. Through consistency, through honoring her own needs without making me responsible for them. And I responded in kind. And together we built something that felt adult in the best sense. A partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. And it was not lost on me that she, the woman who had never betrayed me, who had never diminished herself for love, was thriving in this structure, her confidence deepening, her laughter more frequent. And I understood then that a truly happy ending is not about reclaiming what was lost but about creating conditions where everyone involved can retain their dignity. On a quiet evening much later, as we sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard, their voices rising and falling like a familiar song, she leaned her head against my shoulder, not possessively but comfortably, and said that she felt safe here, that for the first time in a long while she did not feel the need to perform or prove or endure. And hearing that, I realized that peace, the thing I had chosen when everything fell apart, had multiplied rather than diminished, that by refusing chaos I had not sacrificed passion but refined it. And I looked at my children, at the woman beside me, at the life unfolding without force or fear, and I understood that the story people might tell about my marriage ending would never capture the truth. Because the truth was quieter and stronger, that she had chosen her lover. Yes, but in doing so she had released me to choose something far more enduring. A future where love was not a battleground but a shared refuge. And in that future, everyone, including her in her own way, was free to grow, and that, I finally understood, was the real victory. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing the shape of what happened. And by the time the final season of this story arrived, it did not feel like an ending at all but a settling. Like dust finally resting after a long storm. And I realized one quiet morning, while standing in the doorway watching the woman I loved help my daughter braid her hair with patient hands and unforced warmth, that happiness does not announce itself loudly. It simply becomes obvious when you stop bracing for pain. And the life we had built together was not dramatic, not fueled by constant intensity or fear of loss, but grounded, steady, deeply respectful, and in that steadiness my children flourished, their laughter no longer cautious, their questions no longer edged with anxiety, because they trusted the emotional climate of our home. And that trust was the most fragile and precious thing I had protected since the night everything fell apart. My ex-wife eventually found her own balance. Not through the man she had chosen but through a slow reckoning with herself. And when she came to me one afternoon, years after our separation, to thank me for never turning our children against her, for choosing restraint when anger would have been easier, I accepted her gratitude without pride or bitterness. Because forgiveness, I had learned, is not something you give for closure. It is something you practice to remain free. And in that moment I felt no urge to revisit the past or correct it. Only a quiet acknowledgement that we had both survived the consequences of our choices and grown in different directions. The woman beside me, the true heroine of this ending, never asked me to erase my past or compete with it. She simply stood firmly in the present, claiming her place without apology. And it was that self-respect, that refusal to shrink or dramatize herself, that made her happiness so enduring. Because she was not rescued by love, she met it as an equal. And when I finally asked her, not out of fear of losing her but out of certainty that I wanted to keep choosing her, to build a life officially, permanently, she did not cry or gasp or hesitate. She smiled, calm and radiant, and said yes in a voice that carried no doubt, only intention. And our commitment did not rewrite fairy tales. It rewrote expectations, showing our children that love can be rebuilt without erasing the past. That dignity can survive betrayal. That peace is not weakness but wisdom matured through pain. On the evening we moved fully into our shared home. Boxes still unpacked, the children asleep upstairs. We sat together on the floor surrounded by half-finished life and talked about nothing important and everything meaningful. And I understood then that the ending I once feared, the one where my marriage collapsed and I was left behind, had never been the true ending at all. It had been a passage, a necessary breaking that redirected me toward a life rooted in clarity and self-worth. And as I looked at her, confident, whole, choosing happiness without sacrificing herself, I knew that this story had honored its promise. Because she was happy, deeply and unapologetically, and I was at peace. Not because I had been chosen again, but because I had learned how to choose wisely. And in that shared understanding, in that quiet home built on respect rather than fear, the story closed not with regret or triumph, but with something far rarer and stronger. A love that arrived after the storm, intact, honest, and free. That's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.